Hello and welcome to this evening's session of Well Versed, the series of discussions between myself and poets who featured at Stanza 2022. I'm thrilled this evening to welcome Luke Kennard to the virtual Stanza room. This evening's session, if I suppose more than ever, if we needed any additional proof, is evidence of the value of the virtual kind of space. I'm currently actually away in Spain on annual leave. Dan, my colleague who's doing the tech tonight, is away from home down in London. And Luke is joining us. Sorry, it doesn't sound quite as glamorous, Luke, I'm sure it is, from Birmingham this evening. And as ever this evening, we're going to hear a little bit of Luke's work. We're then going to have a bit of a chat, particularly looking at the role of narrative within Luke's work. We'll then hear a bit more of Luke's writing at the end. Before we get started, a quick introduction to Luke Kennard, in case anyone's not familiar with his work. He's a poet, he's also a novelist, he's also written for the stage and radio. In fact, even though I know his work really well, I was amazed in advance of this session to discover quite how prolific he actually has been over the years. I don't say that with any degree of envy at all, honestly. His poetry has received recognition right from the start. In 2005, he was the recipient of an Eric Gregory Award with his first collection, the Solix Brothers. Then he was the youngest ever nominee for the Forward Prize for Best Collection with The Harbour Beyond the Movie. Of course, this was a prize which he did win last year with his most recent collection, Notes on the Sonnets. He was one of the 2014 group of Next Generation Poets. In terms of this sequence of interviews, Luke's work provides a really fascinating subject to exploration. Anyone who attended Stanza this year, either live or online, will be aware that the question of narrative and poetry was up for exploration. And in this regard, Luke doesn't only work in different forms, the poem, the novel, script, but in his use of the prose poem or dramatic monologue, or his reliance upon the unreliable narrative voice, he often uses devices in his work which cross formal or generic boundaries. Yet across his entire oeuvre, what I'd like to suggest is consistent is his use of a distinctively surreal form of narrative, humour, and beyond that, social commentary. I don't want to box your work in advance, Luke. Does that sound about right to you? And might you be willing to read a short excerpt or something just to get us started?
Sure, thank you, Lucy. Yeah. My neighbour is doing a little bit of trumpet practice, so apologies if that's audible. It's quite nice, actually. It's quite a nice little background.
Fantastic.
Kookaburra sits in the old country. Classic film. I'll read. I'll just read a little bit from Notes on the Sonnets, which is a series of 154 prose poems based on Shakespeare's sonnets. And this one is in response to Sonnet 6, Then Let Not Winter's Ragged Hand Deface, which has lots of multiples of 10 in the original. It's one of the procreation sonnets, although I try to take it in a different direction. I had a dream that there were 10 of you, and we lived in a duplex overlooking the river. It was the only nice part of town. I wanted to make 10 of you happy, but it was difficult, and mostly I felt like I was letting at least 8 of you down. Even though the 10 of you were exactly you and exactly the same, you cannot stroke 10 people's hair and tell them they are so good, and oh, the divergent seconds where lived experience changed you. Even the inanities. I love what you've done to your hair. Is that a new top? Could you just shift over a little? I didn't think I was up to the job. So this is a job for you. I don't want to make any special claims here. Nobody ever walked down to a river without at least considering taking a dive. We only owned 9 mugs, for instance, and it only struck me years later, snowfishing in a void I'd learned to wrap around myself, how easy it would have been for me to do something about that.
Thank you, Luke. I'm going to kind of move on to talking about notes in the sonnets specifically later on. But I'm going to start with a few kind of more general questions, I suppose, about the role of narrative in your work. So I think it's probably fair to say I'm not a fan of binaries, but your work would frequently be characterized as belonging to the more experimental end of what I like to think is a very messy spectrum of poetries. And yet within that, maybe you're unusual to the extent to which you're actually drawn to narrative. Would you like to comment on that, or maybe say anything about, what does narrative mean to you?
Yeah, like I mean, maybe there's an extent to which of just being a bit of a magpie as a writer in a way. So it's like, so there are so many like sort of really proper committed experimental writers whose work I love, but also I can't do that. Like it's not me. So it's kind of, it would be disingenuous to pretend to be. I mean, I suppose I think one of the things I really started writing was when I was trying to sort of take it more seriously, or take myself more seriously as a writer. I wrote monologues for drama students at universities. We just have this like script in hand scratch night in the basement of a pub that we used to do, and I would
Brilliant.
never performed anything, never read it, wouldn't have dreamed of reading any of my own work out. So my thing was just every fortnight it would be like, what ridiculous thing can I get them to say, what ridiculous speech can I get them to read out? So I really like that you mentioned kind of dramatic monologues. Obviously there's the kind of Browning tradition of that in poetry, where it's a voice that's other than your own, but you can kind of explore your own voice with it as well, I guess, too. And it's sort of how sort of convoluted can you make a speech before it completely falls apart? Can you keep an audience with you, especially if it's a fairly judgmental, drunk audience of 50 people who are sort of there? But then I think it was like maybe later on, and just reading poetry and coming across like Baudelaire's prose poems, say, and maybe, I don't know, maybe other stuff as well, but just thinking, like Auden in The Orators, W.H. Auden, The Orators, which is a very weird book, came out in 1930, before he kind of wrote all of his famous wedding and funeral poems. And The Orators is just bizarre, and it's in all kinds of different forms, and some of the bits in The Orators are just speeches, but like speeches that kind of fall apart in that kind of vaudeville kind of way. Like I suppose we think of like music hall as being just one thing, but actually often like vaudeville and music hall allowed for these quite strange speeches and like fake talks, which sort of reminds me a bit also of like the way Anne Carson uses lectures and talks in her work, like the lectures that completely fall apart or explode in different directions. So there's like a freedom to that, I think. So there's a freedom in using story and using narrative in the work that for me just seemed like whatever form I was trying to write in, you can hold someone's attention as long as there's something of a story, there's something to sort of keep it going, and then you can go off on tangents, and you can throw in these quite images or sort of analogies that stretch almost to breaking point, but it snaps back because you've got some sense of story.
So how do you actually access these narratives in these worlds? So I'm thinking about maybe other poets who I'd consider as working in a sort of more sort of surrealist tradition, who use various processes in order to access that type of writing. Do you use processes, or does it come from improvisation, or is this actually what Luke Kennard world is actually like?
This is just my inner life. This is just
is this your world, Luke?
I think like I tried to sort of write about this a little bit in Cane, where there are a couple of kind of autobiographical pieces there, like memories of school. And when I was writing that, I just remembered like most of the time at secondary school, I just ran around deliberately annoying people with overly complex verbal fantasies. Like it was just this, instead of actually trying to engage with anyone on any sincere or real level, perhaps I'm just still doing that to a certain extent. But like I wasn't much of an athlete, like no shit. But like so at lunchtime, all the boys would just play football, and I would just irritate them, and I had these ongoing narratives, these ongoing stories. I would just run around telling them these stories. This was until the age of about 16, you know.
How was it received?
Very badly. You know, they were really, you know, it's just really irritating. I was sort of tolerated to a certain extent. I think my sense was like, not really being tolerated very much anyway, so I might as well just be my true self. I think this was just something that occurred to me when I was about 12. It's just like, I don't really fit in, and no one particularly likes me, so maybe I'll just be this kind of like this possessed little terrible stand-up who just runs around. Like people, there's this sort of cliche that like comedians say, like, oh, I developed humor as a sort of defense mechanism. And for me, I think it was more of an offense mechanism, preemptive. It was so I just couldn't really exist in any other way. And these sort of stories they would have advertisement breaks. So sort of, I would go into such an obsessive level of detail with it. So maybe that kind of.
So it's like kind of habitual improvisation and just kind of extension of stories. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I can still just tune into that. Like, I don't mean to make that sound like any sort of a highfalutin thing or a blessing or a curse, but I feel like I can still tune into that. And writing, whether it's a sort of poem or if it's just a sort of some kind of monologue or piece like that or a prose poem, it does feel more like kind of musical improvisation. It does feel more like I can just enjoy this. I can just see where it goes. So it's sort of, and that is a process in a way. It is like I do feel completely different when I'm doing that to I do.
It's a headspace, but it's not a formal process, as in And in terms of narrative, so as I said in the introduction, you write poetry, which is probably what you're best known for. I'll say that's a question mark at the end. You also write fiction, you write script. Is your approach to narrative and is your approach to writing similar across forms, or does it really vary? So I know at the moment you're working on a new novel. Is that a different headspace, or is it just a different version of the same headspace?
I think with the novel I'm working on at the moment, I've tried to make it more, I've tried to make it closer to poetry. I've tried to make it a bit more in line with the way I can kind of enjoy myself and feel quite confident when I'm writing poems, for better or worse. With fiction, normally I find that a bit of a slog, and it's the plot that kind of trips me up. It's this sort of sense of this has to sustain for like such a long time, and this has to, you can't kind of mock it at every level. It can't be a sort of it can be an anti-narrative, but that's just as difficult to pull off as a linear narrative. Like, so I struggle with that, and I think early attempts at writing fiction just completely fell apart because of that, because I wasn't doing anything that I was good at. I was just doing what I thought a novel had to be. So I had like three completely novels that just tanked, that just didn't go anywhere. And then I've had like 2 novels out, and then this third one, it's like I really want to make this less arduous for myself, and hopefully less arduous to read, and just something that has that same energy, and that has that. So I'm tricking myself into thinking that it's writing poetry. So I write in very short sections. Sometimes they expand a little bit, but it's like I'm writing it as if it's a sequence of prose poems, and that seems to be the way I can trick myself into being better at it. I think, I don't know, I think that's probably a life's.
That was going to be my next question anyway. And it's quite interesting that, so you're writing a novel and you're trying to make it more poetry-like, whereas actually in your poetry, you use a lot of devices which I'd identify more as being to do with fiction or to do with performance. Or so what I was going to ask is, maybe actually is the demarcating line between these forms not quite as straightforward as that kind of question might suppose?
I think it doesn't have to.
Or for you, are fiction and poetry very different things for you?
I feel different when I'm writing fiction. I feel like a different person in a way when I'm writing fiction. It feels like a different voice. It feels like it feels like there's a sort of necessary slowing down, not that I'll kind of plan something through, but just that it needs to be explained in a different way. Or to a certain extent, I think you can get away with not really explaining much at all in a poem. You can just let it run, see where it goes. But I think the sort of borders.
Have you felt that less in the latest work?
Yeah, I've definitely felt more like I'm actually enjoying myself writing it, which is good. I mean, you kind of live for those moments where it's not a slog, where you're just like, okay, this is actually possibly going somewhere. This is maybe actually worth doing? I don't know.
I'd love you to tell people what it is. We were having a bit of a chat about
what I can sort of
be. So yeah,
trail it. Yeah, no. So it's based on this social psychology experiment in the 1960s called Black Bag, where a professor paid somebody to dress up head to foot in this bag, completely featureless bag, and sit in his lessons, not interacting. He wasn't allowed to say anything, just sat there in the classes for a whole term. And he just recorded the students' reactions to this person in a bag. And at first, the students were very uncomfortable with this weird silent interloper in their seminar, and just behaved with some hostility towards them. And then gradually they came to accept their presence over the course of like 12 weeks. Until eventually they became quite affectionate. The black bag person had not said a word this entire time, but they came to accept and to even like black bag. And it's sort of, and I guess it's partly the sort of testing the proximity theory and the sort of mere exposure theory, which is that we can sort of come to love anyone or anything just via repeated exposure to the same stimulus. It can go either way. Like, you can hear the same song over and over again and not like it any more than you did the first time. but in kind of social interaction, you just gradually, you can come to actually really accept something that you found kind of abject at first. There's lots of kind of wonderful sort of arcane kind of research to sort of get involved around it, which is good. And then it's just kind of plotting out kind of Picaresque ridiculous story. Like, I'm doing it from the point of view of the out of work actor who is paid to be Black Bag. And then he starts wearing the bag in his personal life outside of the experimental setting as well. And then the plot just kind of weirdly unfolds from there.
I love it. Your work has quite often been described as working within surrealism, and there's this attraction which is coming through as well with what you've been saying about this new book, which sounds fantastic, in the quite bizarre. What is it about the sense of things being beyond reality, or this strange kind of version of reality, which is more interesting or appealing to you than, let's say, straightforward, down to earth every day? And would you say within that, so if people think about surrealism, they'll probably think back to sort of mid-20th century. Is there anything which you'd say is different about surrealism now compared to surrealism in that kind of heyday? Big question, sorry.
No, that's a good, really good question. I think in its sort of development, maybe a little bit like absurdism as well, the whole point was to sort of destroy bourgeois society, to sort of point out how hypocritical the mores of polite society were. It's sort of, I think now it's a tool that you can use. I think you draw on the past, you draw on what it was, but I think it's a tool that you can sort of. One of my PhD students wrote a poet and novelist called Jenna Clake, wrote on the way the surrealist movement mostly suppressed or neglected women writers, and therefore that there are loads of kind of themes that just barely come up in original surrealism because they were mostly deliberately not publishing women. And it's, but like, it still exists. I think it's still a part of our, I suppose what part of what they were trying to do was sort of map a kind of inner life, or map the kind of the imagination or the unconscious, right, to a certain extent. And that's still there now. And it's still, in a way, our inner lives are as much sort of a part of our reality as our kind of day-to-day life. So it's not a kind of rejection of the everyday. I think it's just, to me, it's quite a useful tool to write about more or less anything. You can sort of skew it, and you can be, I think, again, it's about a kind of restraint. Like, I think if it just goes off, if literally anything can happen, then it's boring, right? If it's just a I mean, I'm very interested in dream narratives and dream logic and things like that. But I think if it becomes completely arbitrary and just a lion can fall out of the sky and land on your lap, it's just whatever. Like, why would anyone care? Why don't you read beyond a couple of lines? So there has to be this kind of restraint. It has to be anchored in a kind of reality as well. And that's whether you use a kind of long-suffering, reasonable voice as like the narrator who is having to deal with all the strange things happening, or whatever it is, or whether it's sort of set half in the real world and half in a world where, I mean, enough strange things kind of happen as well, I guess, that it works. But I think, yeah, you do. It's useful to draw something. I mean, so actually, often when you go back to like writing by like Breton and Benjamin Perret and some of the original surrealists, it's like, it's not great actually when you read it. You sit down and read it. It's like, oh, this is a kind of a bit corny half the time. It's a bit kind of a bit sort of try hard, and it kind of sometimes lacks that. For me, lacks that kind of restraint. Lacks the thing that you could.
Yeah, it lacks a spontaneity or
Yeah.
I wonder. So one of the big aspects I think of your work, which doesn't get commented on as much, is the way in which it engages in social commentary. And I wonder whether the sense of actually existing or writing in a world slightly beyond the real or the absurd or the surreal is actually a way of accessing a way of actually engaging with social political issues without actually being head on or not.
No, it very much is, right? And it's kind of, and I think it's just like, I suppose I just feel like why would anyone want to just listen to me pontificating, right? You need to find some way of being entertaining or engaging, and then you can draw in injustices that you care about or hypocrisies that you are irritated by or angered by, and it's kind of, and you can do it in a way that isn't just stating it plainly. Otherwise, just train as a journalist, I guess, is my feeling. I don't know. I mean, it's not to be sort of against kind of polemical poetry, which can be amazing. It's just sort of, but I think it's the only way I feel like capable of exploring more sort of serious things. I think sometimes you have to come full circle as well. You have to go through kind of these layers of irony to get back to why you started speaking in the first place sometimes.
How does that sit with a more sort of improvised aesthetic? Because almost by definition, if you're improvising, you're not deliberately controlling what you're saying. And so then if that's engaging with social or political issues, how it is something I'm absolutely really fascinated about in my own work. How does that sort of tension, kind of sit with you in terms of you're not actually necessarily controlling what you're communicating?
Yeah. Well, it's a sort of hold and release, isn't it? It's a sort of fort da thing that Freud writes about. It's like, so sometimes you're controlling it, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're in a kind of free fall, and sometimes you have to catch the rope. But the point you raised there is a really interesting one, in that there's some, and perhaps just over many years, not just back in the original Surrealists, but like, if it's like anything goes, and I'm going to write these completely ridiculous metaphors or analogies that barely mean anything, then you can sort of, and you're just picking words at random, you're just channeling whatever chaos you are. I think you can then, there's maybe a danger that you can actually be quite sort of offensive. Like, I think even with the sequence of anagrams, I'm quite interested in working with restraints as well. And when you're working with anagrams, it can sort of say something really awful, and it's like, it's just the anagram, it doesn't mean. It's like, that's actually completely disingenuous. Like, you are still the curator, even if all you're doing is running a sort of Google Deep Thought program to randomly generate poems. You're still selecting that. You're still saying, yeah, this one goes on the page, this one I want people to read. That's a creative act in itself, as much as just selecting words is a creative act, right? So you have a responsibility. And you can't kind of have this sort of get out clause of like, oh, I accidentally said something really misogynistic in this poem or whatever. Or I sort of came up with a metaphor that like made a joke out of something really serious. Like, this is, I think, something that needs to be talked about quite a lot. I think we're right. The sort of nonsensical ideas of freedom of speech that just is such a reductive conversation sometimes.
So have you come back to some of your work, which has been very improvised, and gone, okay, do you know what? No, I'm going to edit that out. I'm going to change that. Or do you think it's much more of a inherent part of the process?
It's an inherent part of the process, but I think you do go back, but I think you have plenty of opportunities to go back, and to, in the way that, like, I suppose, like, whatever you think of like David Lynch as a filmmaker, but it's like he made that weird film Rabbits, and then he ended up just using it in Inland Empire in a kind of different way. And it's like, so you have this stuff that you've improvised, you have this stuff that you feel like you've just grabbed crawling out of your unconscious and made something out of, but then you decide how to use it, and then you can come up with it. I tell my students this all the time, like, if you're using collage, if you're using like a random collage technique, open a book at random and take a line, open another book, jam the sentences together. But then I'm like, if you're not happy with the result, then fake it, you know, make it up a bit, add a few words, but like, so go with the kind of elements of like surprising yourself with what happens by chance, but then still remember you can just also just write whatever you want as well. You do have sort of choice in it, so it has to be that. And I suppose I feel like all composition at some level is just improvisation. The difference is just speed. The difference is whether you are listening to somebody improvising live, which I'm not capable of. I never do that. But or whether it's a sort of great symphony that's been written over many years, but it's still like every part of that symphony was at some point was improvised, was just grabbed out of the ether or the mind. So it's yeah, definitely to go back to what you're saying, like I think I do, because I've been doing this for like 17 years now, and sometimes I look back on like collections from like the early 2000s or like pamphlets, whatever, and I'm just like, it's kind of almost lucky in a way that I didn't sort of say something that was actually just really insensitive. I'm trying to think of an example of what that might be. Like it wasn't through my own virtue. It was just sort of, yeah, I don't know. I haven't given it like a proper sensitivity read. I think generally, and I hope that like I was kind of engaged enough with ideas around actually trying to be sensitive or compassionate, however weird the writing was, that it was sort of that the frustration was often at a lack of that. So it'd be a real shame if that work itself contained. But I've definitely, yeah, I've seen kind of, I don't know, work that is supposed to be kind of edgy or experimental, and it's like, actually, this is just crass and unpleasant and abrasive and cruel. And it's like, so what is that? What are you doing with that? What's your actual point here? It's like, it's fine when it's for sort of I think anger when it's for kind of worthwhile political ends, that's like great. That can be, I think, like anger when it's not punching down. But like so much of sort of edgy material, whether it's sort of humor or the surreal, has a tendency to punch down.
Right. Yeah. I've got one last sort of area to explore, and then I can't believe it's almost 7:30 already. But one of the things which was up for exploration at Stanza this year was this notion of actually rewriting existing narratives, which is certainly something which you do. So I'm thinking here of the sequence of anagram poems in Cain, which draws upon Genesis, or rewriting your approach to updating historical tales with a contemporary kind of context, whereas it seems to me that you quite often do something quite different. Is that a conscious thought, or what's your interest in existing bits of writing?
My connection went a little bit wrong there, but I heard most of that.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
No, that was me.
I think Spain's internet connection is kind of dropping in and out. Sorry.
I think it's like, I think the freedom within that, so the sort of freedom that relating to another text gives you, responding in some way to it and not feeling bound by it, just taking it as an opportunity, as a sort of springboard into something else, probably quite influenced by the way like Anne Carson uses classical mythology, right, that is with such kind of bravado and so kind of veers off on beautiful tangents, does something so unexpected with the original material. I don't think I'd ever be fully capable of doing that, but that was definitely something that informed or like gave me some permission in a way, because I'm not interested in like cover versions necessarily. I'm also not interested in just like writing really appreciative pieces. Like, who cares? Like, everyone knows the sonnets are amazing. You don't need another person to tell you that. It's kind of more interesting to kind of wrestle with them a bit and to be quite arrogant about that. I think that's much more interesting. I think if you don't feel kind of that sense of like, I am going to, in the most misguided way possible, I'm going to meet this work as an equal, or at least the voice that I use is so delusional that I'm going to write as if I am, without question, capable of meeting the writer of the
meeting Shakespeare in the nose. Yeah.
Is that, and that kind of, so, and I think that, and to me, like, that sort of level of insolence is kind of important. Like, we don't read the Knights Errant tales anymore, but we do read Don Quixote. Like, there are kind of parodies that, I'm not saying that that's the same with responding to literary classics necessarily, but like there are parodies that kind of have that sort of spirit and that we still return to because of that because of that slightly anarchic spirit, I think.
Fantastic. Okay. We've just got time for one last little fragment of writing. Are you going to read something else from Notes on the Sonnets, or
I'll just there's one that I don't really read out very often, but I just thought, because it's set at this party, and then there's this one about leaving the party. It's a sort of nightmarish, distorted party, and like people keep trying to leave and they just end up back at the party or back at a very similar party. It has this weird...
Are any of these stories, in terms of the house party and Notes of the Sonnets, actually based on reality, I have to ask?
Yeah, bits, definitely. Yeah, there are certain things that happen. Like I really did standing on the balcony at some stranger's party. I can't remember this was. Where I forget where, but like I just ended up there. It was like 2 a.m, and I was worrying about how to get back to my travel lodge that I was staying in. I think I must have been there like external examining or something. And then in my glass of rum and coke, I saw the travel lodge logo and realized that it was a reflection, and that this flat that I'd ended up in was right next to my my travel lodge. And that, so I was like, that's so good, and I can sort of use that weird image of the logo reflected, and I use that to talk about that sort of medicine that uses like a trace of something, that the water is supposed to have a kind of memory, so like this logo stays in the guy's glass for like the rest of the party wherever he is. So there are like little bits of reality that then kind of get sort of reused and kind of recycled and come up. It's kind of based on like every party I've ever been to, I guess.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. This is one about this is one about an attempt at leaving and trying to get home, but then finding your home sort of distorted. And it's sonnet 152, in loving thee, thou knowest I am forsworn. On the way home, we bought 3 packets of noodles and an apple pie from the 24-hour garage. We had to ask the attendant at the window, and he had to sigh and go and fetch them for us. You said 3 packets of instant noodles and a pie of some description. And he said, you have to specify what type of pie. And you said apple. You sat in a shop doorway and talked to a former nurse who showed you her ID card and said, look what I used to look like. You gave her £30, which she promised to spend on a hostel, and you said that you didn't give a fuck what she spent it on. We walked through the park where we couldn't see anything but a distant row of houses like a Christmas decoration. We passed 3 estate agents. A car slowed down alongside us and then sped up again. We picked our way through the service alleys between the terraces dammed with branches and bits of bike. It felt strange seeing our house from behind, as if we had crept up on it, which we had, as if we might catch it entertaining another family, which it was, as if a baby was riding around on a man's shoulders in the kitchen, which he was, as if a woman was making a large pot of coffee, which she was, as if a child sat on the floor in rapt attention, rearranging the fridge magnets into a pattern that was of great significance and urgency to her and her alone.
Thank you, Luke. That was absolutely great. I love the fact that you seem to read different poems every time I hear you read kind of from this collection. So it's like, yeah, I feel like I'm getting this tapestry of different bits of the collection bit by bit. We're going to have to draw things to a close. Massive thanks to Luke for joining us this evening. We've got one more session from this series of Well Versed, which will happen next month with Nidhi Zak. And then I'm glad to say that we have managed to secure funding so that this sequence of discussions can carry on again next year. We'll probably take a break in August, then we'll be back in September. But once again, massive thanks to Luke. It's been a pleasure, as always, to talk to you. And everyone who's joined us tonight, hopefully see you next month with Nidhi Zak. Thanks. Bye-bye.